I have written another article for New Eastern Outlook. This one is titled Washington's War in Ukraine, Narrowing Options, Growing Consequences. I wrote this on November 29th. This was published November 29th, 2024. And as I read this to you, there is an ongoing US-backed terrorist offensive in northern Syria, threatening overrunning the northern city of Aleppo. Second largest city for Syria is Aleppo, and elsewhere along what had been the line of contact for years. It had been frozen for years, and now this has reignited. So I want you to keep that in mind when we talk about how this conflict in Ukraine will be resolved. The US is talking about freezing the conflict there. For what purpose? To achieve peace? No. To rearm, regroup, and relaunch hostilities under terms more favorable for the US and its Ukrainian proxies, just as they're doing in Syria right now. So I'm going to read through this. This is more commentary than actual analysis. There aren't any real sources in here that I reference. I will just read through it, and any additional information I think is useful I will include. So let's just begin. Russia's use of its Oreshnik intermediate range ballistic missile in eastern Ukraine represents an unprecedented escalation in what began as a US proxy war against Russia in 2014. We remember the US openly overthrowing the elected government of Ukraine, installing a vehemently anti-Russian client regime in its place, which then immediately pursued anti-Russian policies across the entire country. And Ukraine is comprised of a very large percentage of people who are Russian-speaking, who may even identify as Russian, as was the case with most people in Crimea. And so that was meant to create a deliberate strategic dilemma for Russia right on its borders. And eventually, they would militarize it, begin arming Ukraine. And the purpose was to do to Russia what they did to Russia from 2003 to 2008 with Georgia. Overthrow the government, arm them, train them, and then sent them against Russia in armed conflict, only on a much larger scale in terms of Ukraine. Very important to remember all of that. The missile's capabilities represent a serious non-nuclear means of striking targets anywhere in Europe without the collective West's ability to sufficiently defend against it. I've been listening to Alexander Mikuris of the Duran. He has actually done several videos regarding the capabilities or suspected capabilities of the Oreshnik intermediate range ballistic missile. And if what he is saying is true, then what I'm saying here may even be an understatement. But it remains to be seen. The possibility of the West now facing direct consequences for what has so far been a proxy war may reintroduce rational thought across the West, otherwise not required when spending the lives of others. This is a proxy war against Russia, fought at Ukraine's expense. You will hear many American politicians and military leaders brag about how efficient this is. You're killing thousands of Russians without a single loss of an American life, which isn't actually true. But that's how they see it. They see this as a means of fighting Russia at the full expense of Ukraine without any cost incurred by the US. It may, however, cause Western policymakers to double down, confident in the belief that they remain decoupled from any possible consequences despite unprecedented escalation. And I fear that that is probably what is going to happen. Western policymakers see themselves removed from the consequences of their actions. And as long as that is the case, they will continue doing anything they can, whenever and wherever they can, until the rest of the world makes it physically impossible for them to do so. Now, despite the capabilities, perceived or proven capabilities of the Oreshnik missile, it is fundamentals that is winning the war in Ukraine. It is not any sort of Russian wonder weapon. And Russian President Vladimir Putin even said something to that effect in a recent speech. I will continue. The missiles use is only the latest demonstration of Russia's military and escalatory dominance amid the ongoing proxy war. It alone would be unable to significantly impact the fighting. But because the Russian Federation over the last 2 decades, maybe longer, has invested deeply in the fundamentals of national defense, it complements a range of other capabilities serving as a deterrence against continued Western encroachment. Because again, the expansion of NATO up to Russia's borders, the overthrow of governments along Russia's borders, and their replacement with pro-NATO, pro-EU, pro-US client regimes, this is a direct threat to Russia itself, because the ultimate goal is to eventually overthrow the Russian government, install a client regime into power in Moscow. And many in the US foreign policy establishment have outright said as much. Before the deployment of the Oreshnik, progress of Russian forces along the line of contact in Ukraine had been accelerating, triggering panic across the capitals of Western nations. This was not achieved through any single wonder weapon, but through Russia's post-Cold War strategy of preparing its military forces and its military-industrial capacity to wage a large-scale, prolonged, and intense conflict against Western-backed forces building up along Russia's borders. Russia knew this was coming, and they prepared for it for years. This included the development and large-scale production of both simple and advanced weapons, ranging from main battle tanks and other armored vehicles to drones, cruise missiles, air defense systems, and electronic warfare capabilities, and also things like artillery shells in vast quantities the collective West cannot compete with. Because Russia's arms industry operates under state-owned enterprises, prioritizing state needs over generating profit, the systems required in terms of both quantity and quality were made available. This was possible because of surplus production capacity being maintained across a large number of Russian arms production facilities. Excess labor and equipment that would have been slashed by private enterprise across the West to maximize profits was instead maintained if and when needed. Come February 2022, this excess capacity was utilized and has since been the central factor contributing to Russia's growing success against NATO-backed forces in Ukraine. I believe Russia is also generating huge amounts of trained manpower, effective trained manpower, in addition to its military-industrial capacity. And these two factors, first and foremost, above all other factors, is why Russia is succeeding in Ukraine, where Ukraine and its Western backers are failing. They cannot generate the trained manpower, and they are unable to arm them and equip them, even if they could. The West, on the other hand, is suffering a growing military-industrial crisis. Excess production capacity needs to be built from scratch, taking years or longer. One exception was the manufacturing of 155mm artillery shells in the US. The facilities were actually owned by the US Army, although they were operated by private contractors, and they did deliberately keep excess production capacity around, and that was what allowed them to increase production. Although their increase in production still falls far short of the quantities Russia is producing and will continue producing. Across the collective West, skilled labor shortages prevent assembly lines from being expanded significantly, even if the will and resources exist to do so. In all areas of production, from air defense missiles to artillery shells, the collective West is struggling to meet even the most meager production targets. You need to have a skilled workforce. And if you have an education system that fundamentally does not produce enough skilled labor, how long is it going to take to change that? You're talking about children going through school and coming out unqualified to do these jobs. You need to fix that. How long will that take to fix? A long time, years. It will take years to fix that. Washington, determined to prevail in Ukraine either outright or through severely overextending Russia amid this proxy war, including beyond Ukraine, in Syria, for example, has steadily escalated the conflict from 2014, when the U.S. overthrew the elected government of Ukraine, to 2019, this was under the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, when the U.S. began arming Ukrainian forces, already being trained by NATO under the Obama administration, to full spectrum sanctions on Russia from 2022 onward, to the transfer of artillery, tanks, aircraft, and long-range missiles the U.S. has now finally authorized strikes into Russia itself with. So a steady policy of escalation. Each escalation represents an attempt by Washington and its European proxies to inflict prohibitive costs on Russia. As each escalation falls far short of doing so, additional escalations are devised. Recently, France and the UK have discussed the possibility of sending their own troops into Ukraine as yet another serious escalation of a war the collective West is already all but fighting against Russia directly. As many people have pointed out, launching these missiles into Russian territory requires US targeting data and US personnel on the ground to enter that data into the missile itself. It should be remembered that the US is also engineering crises elsewhere along Russia's periphery, including Georgia, as well as Syria, to similarly overextend Russia. Recent military operations carried out by US-backed extremists in Syria were likely prepared months in advance and launched as a substitute for the West's own inability to overpower Russia in Ukraine. You create enough dilemmas for Russia. Russia will have to eventually begin picking and choosing where it commits its resources and where it accepts having to fall back from. That is the thought process taking place in Washington, and it always has been. And this, again, goes back to the Rand Corporation paper from 2019 extending Russia. And again, looking at the geopolitical measures, it's all about creating chaos, death, and destruction all along Russia's borders and among the allies of Russia, along with targeting its economy and trying to undermine political stability within Russia itself. Now let's talk about narrowing options and growing consequences, or at least potential consequences. Even without the Oreshnik's appearance amid the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, it is clear that the West's attempts to escalate versus Russia have fallen far short of extending Russia in the manner many Western analysts, politicians, and military leaders have hoped. The wider geopolitical effect appears to be bolstering rather than undermining the shift from US-led unipolarism toward multipolarism. And the more death and destruction the US resorts to try to overextend Russia, the more it demonstrates to the rest of the world how dangerous the US itself is to everyone else's peace, stability, and prosperity. Options for escalating are narrowing for the West. The deployment of Western troops in Ukraine would lead to the same problems Ukrainian troops themselves face: a lack of artillery shells, armored vehicles, and air defense systems to protect their forces from the over 4,000 plus missiles Russia has fired on Ukraine each year, and that number is growing too, by the way. The Oreshnik itself represents a non-nuclear means of striking at any target, either in Ukraine or across the rest of Europe. It would be a means by which to inflict serious damage on European and American military targets in the region, further reducing the West's already dwindling military power. The missile, like many others in Russia's growing arsenal, would be able to overcome Western air and missile defenses, both because of fundamental flaws in their performance and because Western stockpiles of interceptors have been exhausted with no means of readily replenishing them. The US Patriot missile system, for example, had difficulties intercepting missiles and drones used by Ansar Allah in Yemen, launched at targets in Saudi Arabia. Russian missiles are more sophisticated and more numerous, and that means many more are coming at one time. This makes it even more difficult for the Patriot missile system to take them down. And the cumulative effect of launching many times more missiles than the US has interceptors means eventually the interceptors will be exhausted, so then it doesn't even matter how capable the Patriot missile system is. It will be incapable of intercepting all of these missiles. This is the dilemma Russia has imposed upon the collective West. Because the collective West's military industrial capacity is so limited versus its overreaching pursuit of global primacy, the use of its military aviation, cruise missiles, and other existing capabilities can only be committed in one of at least three primary regions of focus: Europe, the Middle East, or the Asia Pacific. Were the US and Europe to commit significant forces to a direct conflict with Russia in Ukraine, even if it fell short of nuclear war, it would exhaust military power the West sought to preserve for potential war with either Iran and or China. While there would be no guarantee that these capabilities would tilt the conflict in Ukraine back in their favor, it would guarantee that US-European ambitions in the Middle East and the Asia Pacific would be forfeited indefinitely. The US is now faced with having to choose where it's going to commit its forces and impose primacy. It really has no ability to impose primacy across all three regions: Europe, the Middle East, and the Asia Pacific region. Unless, of course, all of these non-military means the US uses to destabilize and cause death and destruction. If it were able to create enough chaos that way, who knows? Maybe there is a breaking point that could be reached. But in terms of military power alone, no. And this is why I repeatedly go back to the importance of a nation securing itself in terms of national defense, not just against military threats, but the many non-military threats the US utterly dominates the world in regards to. And that includes monopolizing the information space of any given nation, media, education, and even political infiltration. The US has this as its super weapon, and it is very successful and is still extremely dangerous. And unfortunately, far too many nations across the multipolar world remain almost entirely undefended against these capabilities. And again, this could allow the US to take a country without using any military power at all, turning the population against its own best interests, against the political stability of that country, and removing it as a constructive partner for, say, Russia, China, or Iran. The US has already done this successfully many times, and they're in the process of doing it in virtually every country along the periphery of Russia, Iran, and China. It could be that the US seeks to extend its proxy war against Russia in Ukraine across the rest of Europe, with the US itself preserving its military capabilities for its continued involvement in the Middle East and the Asia Pacific. But the conflict in Ukraine has exposed fundamental flaws in the collective West system overall. A system incapable of collectively overpowering Russia, having exhausted itself in the process of trying, will have less fortune still overpowering a much larger and more capable China. So even if the US gets Europe to take over its proxy war in Ukraine so that it can take all of its remaining military capabilities and use them to focus on, say, just China, the US is still going to run into the same problem where they are outnumbered and being outproduced in terms of arms, ammunition, all kinds of weapons and vehicles and aircraft, ships. They're still going to have the same fundamental problem that they had in Ukraine itself. While the US may believe it improves its chances by shifting the burden of intervention in Ukraine on its European proxies, the US still suffers from a fundamental inability itself to produce the amount of arms and ammunition required to fight a similar conflict in the Asia Pacific. The introduction of the Oreshnik, a capability China will almost certainly be capable of producing if it doesn't already possess it, represents a further means of deterring the US and its proxies, a promise of non-nuclear consequences. In a missile exchange, the US and Europe would enter at a disadvantage. This, on top of a large and growing disparity in terms of military industrial capacity, confines US and European options to resorting to nuclear weapons or reformulating a more realistic and constructive foreign policy in the first place. So, as I've said often, the multipolar world needs to create conditions within which it's impossible for the US to pursue primacy any longer. The US will see its options narrowing. I think it already does. And it will see only really two options left on the table: waging nuclear war, even if they think they could wage it in a limited fashion, which is scary because they really think that it's possible, or reformulating their foreign policy to reflect something more rational and constructive and obtainable. Because Russia and China possess their own large and growing stockpiles of nuclear weapons, the West's use of such weapons really isn't an option. But because the current circles of power in the West lack the military strength, intelligence, and moral fortitude to reformulate their foreign policy, from their point of view, they may believe in the possibility of a limited nuclear war they could emerge from with an advantage, believing this may be their only option. Thus, the notion of mutually assured destruction must be fully impressed upon the West now as it was during the Cold War, reintroducing the fear of personal consequences for policymakers so rational thought, unnecessary when spending the lives of others in proxy war, can be reintroduced into the equation. And so, yes, ultimately what I'm saying is that the multipolar world needs to make it clear that as the West continues escalating in a very unsustainable direction, eventually they will begin suffering direct and even personal consequences, as the West is right now trying to impose on the multipolar world. We watched the US and the Israelis killing leaders in the Middle East, threatening leaders in the Middle East. The US now behind a proxy war, a reignited proxy war in Syria, again, threatening to topple and overthrow a sitting internationally recognized government. The West is able to wield this threat almost with impunity because the rest of the world is too sane and mentally stable and rational to try to wield this threat back in their direction. With the Oreshnik missile and missiles like it and capabilities like it, it begins to create a certain sense of personal consequence for the collective West. I don't want to see the situation continue escalating. But if Russia were to use this missile to, say, decapitate the leadership of Ukraine and demonstrate to the collective West that you can kill leaders of countries, of movements and countries, so can we. And we have the advantage. And if this continues, you may face personal consequences as you threaten us with personal consequences. Eventually, ultimately, for the collective West, primacy is irrational, unobtainable. Adopting a constructive role in the multipolar world is truly in the collective West's best interest. Everyone in the collective West's best interest, from the very top all the way across to the lowest levels of society. It truly is the best option for the collective West. Although the circles of power in the West do not see it that way, the rest of the world must continue to work to show them that it is, but also impress upon the Western population that it is, so that they can begin applying pressure from the bottom up as well. I will continue to keep a close eye on all of this as it continues to escalate, as these conflicts now begin to expand back to other countries where they had previously frozen. A warning to Russia, perhaps, that if they accept any sort of deal freezing the conflict in Ukraine, that is all they have to look forward to, is the US rearming Ukraine and reigniting the fighting long after Russia gives up the momentum that it currently has. I'll continue keeping an eye on that. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for the link to this article that I was reading in this video, as well as for ways to help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare and you're just sharing my work with others, all of that is greatly appreciated. That is what allows me to continue doing my work. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.